Okay, so when President Trump kicked off his second term, there was this big promise, right? A fundamental shakeup of American foreign policy, of diplomacy. The administration's line was pretty clear. Cut the red tape, streamline things, make sure the State Department really lined up with the whole America First idea. But, well, here we are, 8 months in, and the stories coming out of Foggy Bottom, they paint a pretty different picture, maybe a more worrying one. You've got career diplomats basically saying this overhaul feels more like a retreat, a, quote, hollowing out that's pushing experienced people aside and, well, weakening the U.S. position globally. So our job today really is to take a deep dive into the sources that are detailing all these changes. We need to unpack the specifics, the vacancies, the power shifts, and figure out what it actually means for how America operates on the world stage. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. And what's really interesting, I think, is that we're not just talking about disagreements over policy, like should we be tough on country X or engage with country Y? No, this is about the actual machinery of diplomacy, the structure itself. So we have to look at, the stated goals, cutting bureaucracy, dealing with what they saw as resistance, and then weigh that against what people on the inside are saying the results are. This loss of expertise, this potential decline in global influence. We need to look at both sides impartially.
And it seems like the most tangible evidence, the starting point anyway, is just the sheer number of empty desks. The data on vacancies, especially from groups like the American Foreign Service Association, AFSA, it's pretty eye-opening.
It really is. It's maybe the clearest symptom, you could say. AFSA, which, represents the diplomats themselves, they're reporting that as of now, a huge chunk of key posts are just empty. We're talking 110 out of 195 ambassador spots worldwide vacant.
Wow. That's way over half. And it's not like they're all just stuck waiting for the Senate to approve them, is it?
Exactly. That's a crucial point from the sources. More than 60 of those empty posts, they don't even have a nominee named yet. So it means the whole system of U.S. representation abroad is running on, well, fumes in some places, lacking those top-level Senate-confirmed envoys in really important countries.
Okay, but help me understand, why is having a confirmed ambassador versus, say, a temporary stand-in, why is that so critical? It feels a bit like diplomatic nitpicking, but I assume the intact is real.
Oh, it's absolutely real. It's baked into how international relations actually work day to day. In a lot of world capitals, protocol isn't just fluff. It's serious business. If the U.S. only has a charge d'affaires that's the temporary person instead of a full Senate-confirmed ambassador, that person often finds their access limited right away. They might not get meetings with senior ministers, or their calls don't get returned as quickly. It hampers everything: negotiating trade, pushing back on bad info, even just managing small potential crises. So the U.S. kind of, downgrades its own standing just by not having that permanent, high-level person in place.
Right. So it's not just symbolic. It has real practical consequences for access and influence. But the sources suggest this personnel issue goes deeper than just the ambassadors, doesn't it? What about inside the State Department building itself?
Yeah, the internal picture is just as churned up, you might say. Lots of other senior jobs, think undersecretaries, assistant secretaries who run whole regions or issues, are filled by acting officials. And many of these acting folks, the reports say, don't have that deep career diplomatic background. And maybe more importantly, the sources point to these fundamental shifts in the whole culture, the promotion system specifically. They're talking about new rules for getting promoted, where the key metric is becoming, fidelity to administration's agenda, how loyal you're perceived to be, which is, a huge departure from the traditional focus on things like expertise, language skills, time spent in difficult posts, that sort of thing.
And it seems like the absolute core of the tension, right? I mean, how do you even measure fidelity in a professional setting like that? It sounds incredibly subjective.
It is highly subjective. And in practice, what the sources suggest it means is prioritizing political appointees, people seen as really loyal to the president, over maybe more experienced career diplomats. We're apparently seeing this play out in really sensitive areas like the Middle East Bureau, a place where you need incredibly deep knowledge of history, culture, politics. And if loyalty starts to outweigh that kind of deep expertise in such a volatile part of the world, your ability to make smart decisions just takes a massive hit. And this really ties back to the president's long-held view, doesn't it? That Foggy Bottom was sort of inherently resistant, maybe obstructionist.
Yeah, that suspicion seems to directly feed into how policy itself is being handled now, or maybe dictated is a better word. The sources talk about this really dramatic centralization of power, and it seems focused around Secretary of State Marco Rubio, especially because he's wearing two hats.
That dual hat role is absolutely key to understanding this. Secretary Rubio isn't just Secretary of State, he's also the acting national security advisor. So when you combine the leadership of the State Department, which handles diplomacy, with the National Security Council, which coordinates policy across agencies, well, you really shorten the lines of decision-making. Power gets concentrated in a very small circle, mostly White House loyalists, apparently. And this effectively bypasses a lot of the traditional input from, the hundreds of experts in the regional bureaus who normally help shape policy.
Okay, but to be fair, don't most administrations try to get a firmer grip on foreign policy to make sure everyone's on the same page? How is this centralization described as different in the sources?
Well, you have to look at the rationale given, right? Supporters say this consolidation is needed for two big reasons they campaigned on. First, cut through what they saw as a slow, inefficient bureaucracy. And second, clamp down on the leaks and the internal disagreements that were pretty public during the first term. So the argument is efficiency and message control, alignment. You have the State Department spokesperson, Tommy Pigott, who defended it. He said the secretary wants bureau's position to impact policy effectively. But then he added this really strong line. He said the department will not tolerate people using their positions to actively undermine the duly elected president's objectives. So the message seems pretty clear. Your job is to execute, not necessarily to debate the orders.
Right, that's the administration's perspective. But the flip side, the deep worry among the career folks, according to these sources, is that this turns the Foreign Service into just, a delivery mechanism. They just carry out instructions, but they lose your ability to use their expertise to actually shape those instructions in the first place.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's where this fear factor the sources mentioned comes in. It's pretty logical, isn't it? If you think your career advancement depends on showing fidelity, and you think offering candid, maybe critical advice could be seen as undermining the president, well, probably going to think twice before speaking up. You just stop.
There's that one quote that really jumped out at me from an official. It kind of captures that shift. They said something like, even early in the first term, you felt you could at least try to raise a red flag. But now, the feeling is, why would I do that? This administration isn't interested. That's pretty stark.
It really is. And that's the definition of institutional self-censorship. When you discourage that critical internal feedback loop, the administration essentially blinds itself. The real damage is that the best, most honest assessments of risks or potential downsides might never even reach the top decision makers. The government starts relying only on information that confirms what it already wants to believe.
And that kind of self-censorship, that fear, it seems to lead straight into the next area the sources highlight. Actual policy changes happening on the ground, plus this breakdown in just basic communication.
Yeah, we're seeing what looks like a real shift in maybe the perceived mission of U.S. diplomacy itself. The sources are pretty clear that offices traditionally focused on things like democracy promotion, human rights. Those seem to be getting downsized or de-emphasized.
And at the very same time, there's a much heavier emphasis on more, let's say, transactional goals.
Exactly. Things like tightening visa rules significantly. And diplomats are apparently getting explicit instructions to really prioritize U.S. business interests overseas. Sometimes the implication is, even over those broader goals like human rights or long-term stability, it's not just a slight change in tone. It sounds like a structural shift in how embassies are told to operate day to day. Commercial diplomacy seems paramount.
Okay, so the mission is shifting, but then you add this other layer, a serious lack of communication from Washington. If priorities are changing fast, but the instructions aren't clear, what are people in the embassies actually doing?
Well, according to the reports, they're scrambling. A lot of embassies are saying they get very little or very delayed guidance from foggy bottom. So staff are left trying to figure out policy shifts from watching the news or reading presidential tweets instead of getting detailed instructions through normal channels. It just creates confusion, it slows down responses to events, and it probably doesn't look great to the host governments either, right? They see a U.S. government that seems internally disconnected.
And maybe the most, unsettling detail in these accounts related to this whole climate of uncertainty and fear is the talk about internal monitoring. Actual rumors about electronic surveillance inside U.S. embassies.
That specific detail, it speaks volumes about the level of distrust. Now, whether it's actually happening or not isn't confirmed, but the fact that these rumors are widespread enough to be reported, it just shows how deep the anxiety runs among the career staff. There's this feeling that they might be watched, not just by foreign adversaries, but potentially by their own side.
And it's not just whispers in the hallway, right? This anxiety has apparently prompted a pretty formal institutional reaction from AFSA, the Diplomats Association.
That's right. And it's maybe the most striking signal of just how bad the atmosphere has reportedly become. AFSA recently sent out a note to its members, and in it, they apparently warned officers to think about getting personal liability insurance. And they specifically reminded people that, quote, interpersonal interactions can be recorded and shared. I mean, when the professional association for your diplomats is telling them to consider insuring themselves against risks within their own workplace, that tells you something fundamental has broken down.
Okay, so let's try to pull these threads together. We've got the empty post, the power concentrated at the top, this emphasis on loyalty over expertise, and this resulting climate of, frankly, fear and uncertainty. When you put all that together, what's the bottom line strategic risk for the United States? What does this mean for America's place in the world?
Well, the big picture risk, the sources seem to argue, is that the U.S. ends up with a foreign service that's sort of strategically sidelined. It's potentially stripped of its influence inside Washington because its candid advice isn't welcome, and it's maybe less effective abroad because its expertise is devalued and its people are operating under a cloud of uncertainty. It seems like the administration is dismantling the traditional internal checks and balances, the mechanisms for course correction, and replacing them with a system focused almost entirely on loyal execution of directives from the top.
And this isn't just an internal D.C. problem, is it? There was that specific warning cited from Ronald Newman, who used to be an ambassador to Afghanistan. He put it in very practical, real-world terms.
He did. His point was stark. He said, if speaking honestly internally is suppressed, the administration will stumble blindly into avoidable dangers.
Right. And that really brings it home for you, the listener, doesn't it? Why these internal State Department dynamics actually matter. They directly affect how the U.S. deals with everything out there. Trade friction, preventing conflicts, cybersecurity, you name it. If the diplomats on the front lines can't give unvarnished advice back to Washington, our collective security and our interests could be put at risk.
Absolutely. That expertise, that institutional memory built up over decades in the State Department. It's a crucial tool of American power and influence. It's not just about military might. And if you erode that foundation, if you prioritize immediate political alignment over that deep experience, you potentially weaken the country's ability to see trouble coming, to navigate complex crises, and to, proactively shape events rather than just reacting to them.
So it really comes down to this fundamental conflict in perspective. The administration says these changes are necessary reforms, making diplomacy more effective, more responsive, while many career officials, based on these sources, see it as causing potentially long-lasting damage to their profession and to America's ability to effectively engage with the rest of the world.
Which leaves us and you with a really critical question to think about after this deep dive. The administration argues that centralizing power and demanding loyalty will make diplomacy more effective in achieving its goals. But how do you actually measure the long-term cost? What's the price of choosing that kind of expediency and top-down alignment over, say, institutional knowledge, candid advice, and expert analysis, especially when you're dealing with really complex, unpredictable global threats that cost, the potential impact on America's global standing and security? That's something that probably won't be clear for years, maybe even decades to come. Something to mull over.